Welcome.
Thank you.
Really nice to be here.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Um,
I'm tired of resenting you guys for not inviting me.
We're not inviting you earlier. We can talk about that. We can talk about that. You've been a very busy man, and you've been writing books and speaking about the need to address addiction and trauma from a very different perspective. And I'm wondering, the last 2 years, something seems to have shifted in our culture and in our world, where all of a sudden, I'm seeing people of all ages reading about trauma. What do you think shifted that all of a sudden so many people are now reading your book, coming to your talks, interested to hear what you have to say after 20 or 30 years of writing and speaking without quite that reception?
Yeah. Well, it's a phenomenon that's not restricted to me personally. I think this is a society in crisis. Mm-hmm. And one sign of the crisis is that people are getting more split and more ideologically hostile because they feel more scared and they become more rigid and defensive. That's some part of the population, but then other people are starting to ask what's going on here. Mm-hmm. And the usual explanations just no longer serve us. Mm-hmm. So the information that underlying much of physical illness or mental illness for sure, addictions, is trauma, is not new. Mm-hmm. The science has been accumulating for decades, but people haven't been asking the questions. Mm-hmm. Now people are starting to ask, what's going on here?
Right.
I mean, in the United States last year, in 1 year, you had almost twice the number of people dying of overdoses as Americans who died in the Vietnam, Afghan, and Iraq wars put together.
Wow.
In 1 year. People are asking why.
Yeah.
And the usual explanations, addiction is a genetic disorder, really? Then how come the numbers are going up all the time? These genes don't change in a population. In other words, people's curiosity and desire to know is catching up with reality.
Yeah, great. I wanted to maybe talk first about in the realm of Hungry Ghosts and addiction.
Yeah.
And you worked in a very kind of low-income area in Vancouver, if I understand right, where you kind of really saw the suffering that addiction was causing, and you really looked at addiction not as a medical problem, but as a relational problem. And I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more about that how we view addiction and how you're inviting us to view addiction.
Sure. So I worked for 12 years in Vancouver's downtown east side, which is North America's most concentrated area of drug use. If you haven't been there, you haven't seen anything. In a few square block radius, there are thousands of people injecting, inhaling, ingesting, selling, buying drugs of all kinds, many of them ill with hepatitis C, HIV, and other complications. 40% of the population there is indigenous Canadian. Indigenous people make up 5% of the population. And it's a scene of poverty and despair. So I worked there for 12 years.
And did you apply for that job intentionally, or did they send you there, or was that happenstance?
Well, they phoned me up. Actually, there was a moment of transition in my life when I was just needing and wanting and looking for a change. Okay. And I got this phone call, would you like to come and work at this rat-infested, bedbug-ridden hotel? And I said, sure, when do I start? But anyway, in terms of addictions, let me give you all a definition of addiction, so including yourself. And I can't see much of the audience, but I'm going to ask for a show of hands in a minute. I'll give you a definition of addiction that I don't think is controversial. So addiction manifests in any behavior in which a person finds temporary relief or pleasure and therefore craves, but then suffers negative consequences in the long term and cannot or does not give up. So pleasure, craving, relief in the short term, harm over the long haul, and difficulty giving it up. That's what an addiction is. Now notice I said nothing about drugs. Of course it could be drugs of all kinds, whether they're legal, like nicotine and alcohol, with which it's perfectly permissible according to the law to kill yourself, but it's not permissible to kill yourself with heroin. You tell me why not? So it could include substances, but it could also be gambling, sex, pornography, shopping, work, eating, bulimia, gaming, internet, cell phones, extreme sports. I could go on. The issue is not the behavior as such. The issue is your relationship to it. If there's pleasure, relief in the short term, and therefore craving and harm, and you don't give it up, you got an addiction. So here's what I'm going to ask now. If according to that definition, you recognize, anybody here in the audience or on stage, within yourself that you've ever had some addictive pattern in your life, just raise your hand, okay? All right, good. Well, that's how common it is. And here's what I'm going to ask you now. So since you raised your hand, I'm not going to ask you what your target of addiction is, what the behavior or whatever it was, but I'm going to ask you, what did it do for you in the short term? What did you like about it? Not what was wrong about it, what was right about it?
Mm-hmm. It made me feel more relaxed. It made me feel like I had power. It made me feel like I could talk to people, I could party, I could dance. I mean, there's probably lots of things, right?
So relaxation, you said?
Yeah.
More power?
Yeah.
More sociability?
Yeah.
All right. Par for the course. Other people will say stress relief. They'll say soothe the pain. It numbed me. It distracted me. It helped me escape from uncomfortable emotions. The lack of power, lack of relaxation, social isolation, distress within oneself, these are all forms of emotional pain. So my mantra is, don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. Now, in other words, the addiction, this whole medical idea, first of all, the social idea of addiction as being some kind of a choice. You know, Nancy Reagan would put these signs on the highways, just say no. Okay, just say no to relief of stress and pain. Just say no to social connection. Just say no to stress relief. That's what those signs really meant. But here's the point. That's the social idea, which is that it's a choice. It's complete. And the whole legal system is based on it. There's millions of people in jails in your country because the law believes that they made a choice to be addicted. And you couldn't have a more nonsensical idea if you tried to invent one. So the whole legal system is based on a fiction for which there are reasons. But then there's the medical idea that addictions are a genetically inherited disease of the brain. The hell they are. What they actually are is their attempt to solve a problem. The problem of emotional pain, of all the things you were missing in your life that the addiction temporarily provided. And then the sources of the emotional pain, and whatever way it shows up, is trauma, wounding. That's exactly what happens. So addiction is not the primary problem. The addiction is the attempt to solve the problem, which is instigated by trauma. And for which, by the way, there's all kinds of scientific evidence. It's not even controversial scientifically. Not that most physicians even have a clue, because they don't talk about it in medical schools. That's all over the subject.
Yeah. And I think actually that's what, when I talk to people, Gabor, some of what people are so drawn to your work and to your voice is because they don't feel like a loser as much anymore. They reorient, they reframe how they see themselves, because the society would see themselves from that old model that if you have an addiction, there's something inherently wrong with you. You don't have enough willpower. You don't have enough strength. And I think part of what you're bringing is more of a compassionate look at it, which I think takes it away from there's a certain person who's an addict versus there's tendencies that we all have. And that there's pain that we all have, and that's really the direction we need to go.
Which, that is how I see it, but it's also how science happens to see it. You know, so it's not simply a matter of trying to find a compassionate approach. It's a matter of trying to look at something objectively. And I think we find over and over again, and those of you that are mindfulness practitioners or spiritual adepts, you'll find that truth has to do with objectivity, and truth always lines up with compassion for some reason.
Yeah. And some people think that if they take on the notion that I choose to do drugs, therefore I can choose not to do drugs, that it's like a question of like, it's empowering for me to say like, I'm choosing now to do this, I can choose not to do this. Where do you see the role of choice in that? And if we haven't worked on our trauma, do we really have choice? Or how do you orient in that question?
Well, when you were caught up in whatever addiction had you in its thrall, how much choice did you experience?
How much?
Choice did you experience?
Not much.
Yeah. So we can talk about choice in the abstract. And in the abstract, we all have choice. Or we can talk about choice in reality, which means how much freedom does a person have to make a choice. And freedom is not simply an external factor. In fact, significantly, it's an internal factor. It requires consciousness. I think you've had Eckhart Tolle here, have you?
Yeah, Eckhart a few times.
Yeah. Oh, you've already had him a few times, and this is. Oh, okay. All right.
Twice.
Okay. So.
We'll bring you 3.
Only
you can come 3
okay.
times, next 3 years.
Okay. So he lives in Vancouver as well, as you know. He lives in Vancouver.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Have you met him and you guys hang out?
So does Tammy Simon, who's here this week.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
She's here.
Yeah, I know.
I think it's her 4th time actually.
4th now, okay. So, but why did I bring Eckhart up? Because he says that without consciousness, there's no freedom. That's one of his statements. And I totally agree with that. So the question of choice has to me, how much consciousness do I have in a given moment? And it's not just a general question, it's also in a given moment, how much consciousness do I have? Because at times I have terrific freedom, and believe me, I can get into emotional states where choice doesn't even appear on the horizon. And the unconscious, this is where trauma comes in again, is very much like a puppet master that pulls us on a string. We have as much freedom as a puppet does when the unconscious takes over. So to me, choice, the real issue with choice when it comes to addiction or anything else is how do we promote people's freedom so that they can have actual choice.
Right. Yeah, Eckhart talks about it like the pain body. There's a pain body that kind of like takes you over. And I think at the heart of kind of one approach is that if there's an underlying wound or trauma, that as long as that can be dormant for a while, right? We might be able to behave in the world and function, but something happens and all of a sudden that dormant trauma becomes triggered and activated, and then all of a sudden a different part of ourselves come out. And I'm wondering, how do you begin to identify what the real source of that is? Like when you're getting trauma ignited. Like I can feel pissed off about a lot of different things at different times, but there's a certain pissed off that has a certain energy or charge to it that feels different to me. It feels like it comes from more than just the situation at hand.
Well, when I teach my students in compassion inquiry, one of the insights I want them to understand is that whenever there's tension, it requires attention. Whenever there's tension, now I wish I could follow that teaching. It's a beautiful teaching, if only I could follow it sometimes. But whenever there's tension here, you pretty much know that you're dealing with the past. Now, how do you get at the sources of the past and what actually happened? Well, there's a whole lot of ways to do it, many therapeutic modalities, some of them, talking therapy or somatic therapy of Peter Levine's, or, sensory motor therapy of Pat Ogden, or my compassion inquiry, or hypnosis, or psychedelics, or any one of these things, in internal family systems of Dick Schwartz. But pretty much any time you realize that your present physiological, emotional state seems out of proportion to what's actually going on in the present. You know that you're in the grips of the past.
Got it. Wow. And when you notice that in yourself, how do you work with that? We had talked backstage. You went through a tough couple months. I know you did something with Prince Harry that a lot of people got all activated by. And I know, everybody can relate to feeling activated by things. And I think when you're a public figure, it's even more intense, right? Because there's thousands of people who can get activated. And I'm curious, how do you navigate when you feel that in yourself? And do you have particular practices or orientations that help you? And I know you've explored psychedelics and explored lots of modalities.
Well, look, I have to confess that I'm just getting through a period where I have not been very adept at applying my own teachings or anybody else's. I've been very much in the grips of the past. So I don't want to sit here and pretend that you listen to some kind of an expert who's got it figured out. I don't. I do understand it, but working it through, I've realized recently again, it's an ongoing process and far from complete in my case.
Yeah.
But the Prince Harry thing was interesting. For those of you, by the way, I should give you a warning here. So I interviewed Prince Harry, and the London Sunday Times wrote an article, and they said, "Don't trust a man who's wearing many rings." Okay, so I'm wearing these same 3 rings that I wore with the. If anybody doesn't trust me, leave. You can get your money back. Okay? if you think I'm wearing too many rings, but the reaction to that interview in much of social media and particularly the British gutter press, which included some of the most famous papers in Britain, was really hostile.
Yeah.
And I thought I was past it.
Yeah. Past being affected by that.
Past being affected by it.
Sure.
And I was surprised how much it got to me.
Yeah.
And especially when you don't have the opportunity to respond immediately,
Right.
And I called up a colleague, a very well-known colleague or friend, a psychiatrist, actually Dan Siegel. Many of you know his work. Yeah. And
he's been here before. Yeah.
Do you have to keep rubbing it in?
Sorry.
Well, he should have been here. And there's a wonderful. Do you know the book, The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse?
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Charlie McKeesey, and has he been here?
No.
Okay. And in the book, the horse is the most grounded of the 4 friends, and one of them asked the horse, "What's the most courageous thing you've ever said?" And the horse says, "Help."
Wow.
It's so hard to ask for help.
Yeah.
But you know what? In the aftermath of this Harry thing, I said, I need help here.
Yeah.
So Dan and I had a conversation.
Yeah.
And he said, what is it about this whole thing that upset you so much, that got to you so much? And you and I were talking about this dynamic before we came on stage here. And I said, it's not being seen. Having a distorted view of me.
Yeah.
And he said, and of course this is precisely where I would take anybody else that I was talking to, but I couldn't get there myself without somebody prompting me. Yeah. And Dan said, well, when you were an infant, and this is true for me, when you were an infant, and those that don't know, I was a Jewish infant under the Nazis in Hungary. When you're an infant, not being seen threatened your life.
Wow.
And I said,
wow.
I got it.
Yeah.
And there was an immediate release
wow.
of that tension,
wow.
you know?
Wow.
So it can show up this many years later in a completely different form and still...
And the relief was just seeing the original, the original kind of source, if you will.
Well, when I I'm sorry, what was the question?
When you said you experienced relief, was the relief seeing the source or close?
I get it now. This is what's going on. And actually, I'm not threatened by any of this stuff.
Yeah.
Who cares what says about whom? I mean, that doesn't threaten me.
Yeah, got it.
But as long as I'm caught in that dynamic of not being seen, threatens my life, literally. It felt like it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, the upset was really disproportionate.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And so that's super, super helpful. And I know that, for me, I notice it's the people often closest to my life I get triggered by the most. So my partner, my son, my parents I don't live with anymore, but if I go to a family gathering, and actually a lot of my family is here today.
Yeah.
It's really hard. It's really hard because I notice myself wanting to be right. I notice myself not being seen or heard. I notice myself like staying really quiet and doing a lot of these things. And I think that, I don't know why I bring that up. It's just, I want to relate to the fact that it's really hard. It's really hard often for me to know how to work with that in those moments.
Mm-hmm. Well.
And my past, if I'll just go to my past often, you talk about, is it like toxic niceness? Is that the word you've used before?
Toxic
niceness or toxic kindness or toxic?
Yeah, I'm not sure I use toxic.
Okay.
But okay, there's a kind of niceness, self-suppression, that it is harmful, it's pathological, it actually creates physical illness, if that's what you're doing.
Right. And so that's often my tendency in times where I notice that I'm not feeling safe, or I'm not feeling comfortable, is I'll go to that. And often, Gabor, I'll have this experience where I'll think I've actually worked through my trauma, or a lot of it, and I'll get continually humbled. Yeah. And I'm curious, I know that I've been to some people that have been to many of your workshops, and they'll say one of the beautiful things about Gabor is when he makes a mistake or says something stupid, somebody calls him on it, and you admit it, and you kind of move on. And I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about...
That's very rare, but, Sorry.
Well, sometimes your own wife stands up and calls you on it. Sometimes a participant calls you on it. Sometimes, and I'm curious because I think, maybe it's more of a man thing, but whenever somebody gives feedback that I don't like or that I don't want, I notice myself instantly defensive. And I'm always looking for guides of people who can receive feedback and actually take that in and make that into some kind of inquiry.
Well, here there's
and I'm wondering if you can help me.
Well, here for me, where there's a kind of there's a split between what I do in public and what happens privately.
Yeah.
Because just like you mentioned yourself, the person that can trigger you the most and trigger me the most aggressive and hostile responses is my spouse. That's where I can talk about what that's about, but in public, when it comes to my ideas or my work, I'm not particularly defensive. I'm very confident in what I'm saying, and I'm very confident in... my ego is not threatened if I make a mistake. So if somebody points it out, if they can convince me I made a mistake, I say, yeah, I made a mistake, no big deal. I'm not threatened by that.
Okay.
But if I'm challenged more personally, in an intimate relationship, I'm much more likely to get triggered and to respond in a difficult way.
Sure. Yeah. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about, you write very eloquently about your relationship with your 3 children.
Yeah.
And how, as a father in the early years, you really weren't connected to them and really weren't present for them. And you've worked hard to heal those relationships. And I know this is also what you're going to be writing about. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about healing relationships with adult connections that really, really matter to us.
Yeah.
Because I'm guessing that all of us here have other adults that we feel distant from who are intimate to us, and it requires a certain kind of healing.
Yeah. Well, my most recent book, The Myth of Normal, that was mentioned in the introduction, I wrote that with my son, Daniel. And in fact, I could not have written it without him.
And was that your idea or his idea, or how did that emerge?
It evolved that way. I showed him the book proposal, and his critique was so acute and his emendation so adept that we just knew that we had to do this together. But this is a boy who was he's a genius. He's 47 years old now. He's a musical theater writer. He's a mental chiropractor, which is a whole other story. He's a wonderful lyricist, award-winning lyricist, wonderful musician, and a highly sensitive person. And when he was small, we didn't get him. We didn't understand him. And their own marriage was in turmoil at times. And children absorb the stresses of their parents.
Yeah.
And so we've had a lot of remedial parenting to do as our kids got older. As we got more conscious about our own trauma and as we became more aware of what our children needed from us as adults. It's been a lot of work. So Daniel and I are now writing another book together that was also mentioned. It's a workshop that we do together. It's called Hello Again, a fresh start for parents and their adult children. And it's a workshop that we've been giving for 6 years. And if you watch on YouTube, you can go on YouTube and Google Daniel and Gabor Maté, and the first talk that we gave in 2016 is seen by about 400,000 people. You can still see us seething at each other on stage. This is in the context of a healing workshop, you understand? Well, that's okay, because we're very open about it. We don't hide it, and we work it out, you know. But it's been ongoing.
Wow.
It's been ongoing work, and it's been a theme with all our 3 adult children.
Yeah. And so how would you, I don't know, advice isn't the right word, but if there's people out here who are listening to this who are feeling like, I don't feel that close to the people that I've raised or my parents or somebody who's really intimate to me, where is the beginning point?
The beginning is here. You know, like once you're an adult child, your parents did all kinds of things that hurt you. In this culture, and it's not to put the blame on individual parents, as we point out in the myth of normal, in this society, it's awfully difficult to be a parent.
Yeah.
This society does not support parenting the way nature designed parenting to be.
Yeah.
And it's a whole other subject. But inevitably, we pass our stuff on to our kids for all kinds of reasons, with the best of good intentions, the best of goodwill. So then you're an adult person and you've got your parents. These are the people. And here's the thing about that relationship. It's completely unique. Because what other relationship begins with one of the partners being a one-celled organism and the other being a full adult? It's an incredible power difference. And then all of a sudden you're supposed, and so 20 years later, now you're supposed to have an equal relationship.
Yeah.
I mean, how is it even possible? You know. So there you are, the adult child, and there's all this history, which begins in the womb already. I mean, already your parents' emotional states start affecting you and your brain development in the womb. But that's just the science. And so, as an adult kid, where do you begin? Well, you have to take responsibility for what's inside you.
Yeah.
Not blame, but responsibility.
Yeah.
Not that I'm at fault for it. In fact, you're not at fault for it at all. But who's going to be responsible in the present moment to deal with that? Only you can do that. And the same with the adults. Same with the parents.
Yeah.
And so that what we teach here is that it's not 50-50, it's 100%, 100%.
Yeah.
And I was talking to somebody today whose mother died before they had reconciled. But this person was still able to come to equanimity with her mother, who had really hurt her sometime after the mother's death. Because this person took on the internal task of healing themselves. So, if both partners are around and they're both willing to work on it, it can be a very beautiful dance.
Yeah.
But it does begin in both cases by willing to take responsibility for what we carry inside.
Yeah.
Not for how it got there,
Right.
but for what we're carrying.
Right. And sometimes people have this notion that's like, well, I'm this way because my parents did this to me when I was a kid. My parents didn't love me then as kids, so I'm this way as an adult, and sorry, you just have to deal with that, right? Like
But that's true. But it's true.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true. But then they keep doing the same harm behavior. And when you bring it up to them, like, well, this is just who I am because my mom did this or dad did this.
I know. Well, then they're not taking responsibility.
They're not taking responsibility. Yeah.
They're trapping themselves in the victim mentality.
Yeah.
That I'm the helpless victim of what happened long ago, and there's nothing I can do about it. It's all somebody else's fault.
Right.
There's an Eastern European joke about that, which goes, "My hand froze off. It serves my father right. He should have bought me gloves." Well, at some point you have to buy gloves for yourself.
Right.
And so, while it's true that we're shaped by what happened to us in childhood, beginning even in previous generations and in the womb, that's all true. But recognizing that ought to be a source of empowerment rather than a source of passivity.
Yeah.
Because once I get it, like, okay, so this is why. Now I can understand it. Now I can do something about it.
Yeah.
Not that I'm helplessly trapped in this vortex of suffering that somebody else inflicted on me.
Yeah.
And there's some people who do that, and that's really doesn't help them.
Right. I was talking to my son the other day. He's in New York. We both have kids in New York, and he's 21, and he's been sick this last month. He was going to be here, but he can't be here.
Oh.
And he said, he's like, it's really hard for me to rest, Dad. We were talking the other day. And I was like, he's like, I know I need to rest. It's really hard for me to rest, and I feel like I need to always be doing something.
You need always to be doing...
Always be doing something.
Yeah.
And he's like, I think I got that from you.
Yeah.
And I was not quite sure how to respond to that because he would play video games for hours on end sometimes, and I'd be like, what are you doing with your life, right? Like, I actually had a judgment about his video game play that I thought there's just a world to live in, right? And so I found myself not quite sure how to respond because I was glad he was telling me, I was glad he was noticing it, but I also kind of feel like he's 21, he can make his own life, he can make his own choices, right? And but I also have to admit to myself that I'm driven in a lot of different ways, and so the feeling he got around me probably was drive.
I would say, Soren...
Am I missing something?
No, you're on the right track, but I think there's something more to it.
Okay.
In my view, see how this feels for you. You may always have been somebody that was doing something and kind of driven and so on. But I would say that the big source of your son's issue is not that it's learned behavior that he got from copying you. It's something deeper than that and more difficult than that.
Yeah.
And even more painful than that. Because if it was only learning, you can easily unlearn it. But actually, when do we, and this is true for me, probably true for you, probably true for a lot of people in this room, certainly in this society, when is it that we keep the sense that we always have to be doing something when we don't think that we are enough, when we don't do something?
Yeah.
When just our existence for being is not celebrated, validated, when we don't feel that we are enough, then we have to justify our being by doing all of that. So that's one source of it. The other source of it is just a discomfort with the self, that I always have to be doing something in order not to be still with myself.
Yeah.
So those are, I think, deeper sources than simply the modeling that you may have provided him with.
Thank you. Yeah, very true, very true. I'm wondering, could you say a little bit about the compassionate inquiry process that you often suggest or work with people? Can you say a little bit about what that entails?
Yeah, so I was in family practice before I went to work in the downtown east side with addictions. I was in family practice, and for 7 years I was also the medical coordinator of the palliative care unit at the Vancouver Hospital, looking after terminally ill people. And as a family physician, I have an advantage over the specialist colleagues. By the way, let's do a little test here. Well, I won't do it, it's okay. I knew people before they got sick. by the time I send you to a neurologist with your numbness or your blindness, temporary blindness, or a gastroenterologist with your abdominal pain and your diarrhea, or a rheumatologist with your inflamed joint, we already know where the disease is. The rheumatologist only sees you as somebody who's already ill. But I knew people before they got sick. And I knew them in the context of their multi-generational families of origin. And I got a clear sense of who got sick and who didn't, and it wasn't accidental. And I distinguished 4 personality traits, and we talk about this in the myth of normal, of the disease-prone personality, and you already mentioned one of them. The first one is an automatic and compulsive concern for the emotional needs of others while ignoring your own. Number 1. Number 2, a rigid identification with duty, role, and responsibility rather than the needs of the self. The third one is this pathological niceness, where people are always so nice and so kind and so friendly to everybody. Why? Because they repress their healthy anger, which is essential for survival. Healthy anger, we have a circuit for it in our brain. It's important for survival. And the fourth one are 2 beliefs. One is that you're responsible for other people feel, and second, that you must never disappoint anybody. Now, these traits, I kept noticing them in people who got sick with rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, malignancy, colitis, Crohn's disease, chronic eczema, psoriasis, any chronic autoimmune disease, and very often malignancies. And the essence of it is emotional disconnection from yourself. Now, at first I just thought I was seeing things. Well, I was, but they were true things. What I didn't know, that there's a vast body of literature, research, showing the relationship of these traits to chronic illness of all kinds, autoimmune disease, malignancy, and so on. So once I realized that, and not to mention, once I began to see the connection between childhood trauma and every mental health disorder you can possibly diagnose, from addiction to ADHD to everything else, I thought, well, it's not enough. It's fine. I need to give people or make people, avail people of the essential physiological medical treatments, but it's not enough. You've got to talk to people.
Yeah.
But who's going to talk to them? My patients couldn't afford private psychologists, and psychiatrists don't understand any of this stuff. It's just not, it's not their fault. It's not part of their training. The average medical student, I want you to hear this and get it. The average medical student does not hear a single lecture on trauma. Not one. In 4 years of undergraduate training, not one. Most psychiatrists have a very shallow understanding of trauma based on their training. So, where am I going to send these people? I have to start talking to them myself. So this is how I stumbled into counseling people. And I began to find out that by asking the right questions, the answers are inside people themselves. So then I began to do counseling and get more and more adept at it. Then I began to do this in groups, and people kept asking me to teach to them what I was doing, and I said, I can't teach it to you because I don't know what I'm doing. But they say, yeah, you can teach it. And finally, they talked me into giving a weekend workshop in Toronto for psychotherapists on this method, so-called. And I was really hoping, honest to God, I was fervently praying that nobody would sign up because I was desperate not to expose my utter incompetence in front of, sure enough, 300 people signed up, and we did it, and it was successful. So then this course evolved from that. I didn't create the course, by the way. That was created from my work. If it was waiting for me to create it, it would still not exist. But it's really based on the essential idea. Well, Have you had H. Almas here?
No.
Oh, well, that's somebody you should have. Do you know about Almas?
I
Yeah.
have yeah.
Okay, well, now he's
Okay.
par excellence.
It's not the diamond approach, is it?
The diamond work, yeah, absolutely, yeah. And Almas says, only when compassion is present will people allow themselves to see the truth.
Wow.
So that's the compassion part. The inquiry part is rooted in my conviction, which is not personal to me, that the truth is inside all of us, that our bodies, as Bessel van der Kolk says, do keeps the score, and that with the right questions in a compassionate setting, people will come to the truth of themselves. So that's what this whole idea is based on.
Yeah. And how much of it is around identity do you work? That somebody sees them, how much of it is around identity?
Yeah.
So if somebody sees themselves, I'm strong, I'm successful, I'm powerful, I'm this particular identity, and I have to be that identity in the world. And the body does not want to go with that because it means you have to suppress another part in order to be the one part. Is that something that you see playing out, and how do you work with that?
Yeah, well, again, I think it was from Eckhart that I learned this, that identity or identification comes from the Latin idem, the same, and facere, to make. So when you identify with something, you make yourself the same as.
Okay.
So if I identify as a doctor, then my status in the world, my self-respect, my value, how I want to be seen, is dependent on that particular role. But who am I really underneath all that? So identification is always, it contains an element of falsehood in it. Even if you identify with something true in yourself, if you make yourself the same as that one particular thing, you're diminishing yourself.
Right.
You're diminishing yourself. And that identification is how we develop the personality. So that the personality is an amalgam really of some genuine traits, but also with certain dynamics that we identify with because we're afraid not to be them.
Right.
So somebody who's very strong will never have the courage, or somebody who identifies with being strong will never have the courage to say help. Because to say help would be to undermine the self-image, or I can handle everything. And believe me, it's hard for me even to fathom this anymore, but in my 40s, I consciously believed that everybody else could be stressed, but I couldn't. That was my belief. Well, what does that lead you to? A very challenging life.
Yeah.
You know, so these identifications which form the shell of the personality are limiting us.
Right. And I often think in our particular world, if you talk to people who are interested in spirituality or those kinds of things, often it's the ability to say no, or to have what you call healthy anger, that often we just don't know how to use, because we've seen examples of that being misused, and we're going to say, we're not that. Right? I'm not that. I'm this other person who doesn't have, but we lose access to the energy of that.
Yeah.
And I think one of the interesting things that Trump revealed, in part, was he had this kind of righteous arrogance that I think people actually kind of gravitated towards, because, in my view, they were out of touch with that in their own life, or they didn't know how to express that in their own life. And I'm curious if you could say a little bit about how you begin to kind of own all these different parts of ourselves, so we have access to whether it's compassion or anger, whatever the energy force is that we're not allowing.
Yeah. Well, Trump is a rather obvious example of somebody who was severely traumatized and had to adapt tough, aggressive, selfish, self-aggrandizing, no self-doubt allowed.
Yeah.
And part of his confidence is that he doesn't doubt himself consciously. Unconsciously, he's full of doubt. You can see it every time he opens his mouth. I mean, who would say that I'm a stable genius? You know,
Or I'm the most humble person ever.
nobody who's stable and nobody who's a genius. Would say that, you know. So he's rather an obvious example who's just completely exiled and suppressed huge parts of himself.
Yeah.
And he came from a family where he was severely traumatized.
Yeah.
His brother drank himself to death.
Yeah.
You know. On the other hand, he's a bit of a too easy a mark. Let me just tell you guys another story about somebody else. If you've read my book, this won't be a surprise to you, but if you haven't, it will be. What if I told you about a 4-year-old girl who's bullied by neighborhood kids and runs into her home to her mommy for protection, and the mother says, "You get out there, there's no room for cowards in this house. No room for cowards here. You get out there and deal with it." Now, how would you see that incident? I think most people in their right minds would see that as the traumatization of a child.
Yeah.
This was Hillary Clinton.
Wow.
This story was told at the Democratic Convention where she was nominated in a video biography narrated by the voice of God, Morgan Freeman. And this incident was presented as an example of wonderful resilience-building parenting.
Wow.
Now, remember what happened to the candidate a couple of months later? She was running for the presidency. She developed pneumonia. What did she do with it? Remember? Nothing. Didn't tell anybody.
Did not stop, yeah.
She kept going till she collapsed, dehydrated with fever in the street. And the message she got was, not that there's no room for cowards in this house, because a 4-year-old kid running to their mother for protection is not a coward. She's a 4-year-old kid.
Yeah.
The message was, there's no room for vulnerability in this house.
Mm-hmm.
You better suck it up.
Yeah.
And this is celebrated in this culture, and she identifies with that part of herself,
Yeah.
which explains so many things about her particular style and life. I'm not talking about politics here, people, although it does impact our politics very much, but what you had in that election was 2 traumatized people running for the presidency. Your choice was, which kind of trauma would you rather choose? You know, and you chose one. There's all kinds of implications, but what I'm saying is that both of these people had, and actually a very insightful conservative columnist in the New York Times, David Brooks, said that what they have in common is that they both resist vulnerability.
Wow.
You know, and in other words, those parts of themselves that are vulnerable are just not to be acknowledged.
Yeah.
And in our, you remember what happened in the previous election? There was a candidate called Michael Dukakis ran for the presidency. And oh my God, he'd been to a psychiatrist. And this was held as a mark against him. And when Jimmy Carter acknowledged that, you know, I've had lust in my heart for other women, oh my God, how can you say such a thing? You know, so anybody who's vulnerable is ridiculed in our politics. And these people that exile those vulnerable parts, they are our heroes.
Right. And we don't want them to say it because we don't want to feel it in ourselves.
That's the whole point.
Right?
That's the whole point.
Yeah.
Or we want somebody who is stronger than we are, who doesn't have vulnerability, so they can take care of us, you know?
Yeah. Ouch. That hurts.
It's how it works.
Yeah. And anybody running, I'm sure there's some presidents who ran without tons of trauma, but it seems that in those positions you have to be driven by something.
Yeah.
And you're right, the examples that we get often, whether it's a business leader, a political leader, a tech leader, or a lot of these leaders, they're presenting themselves as tough and strong and smarter than other people. I don't know Elon Musk, I've never met Elon Musk, but there's an air about them, as if they're the smart ones and the intelligent ones, and admitting that they're wrong is kind of forbidden in that particular world.
Yeah.
And like anything, that eventually has to come up, right? I mean, it's not like we can pretend anything very long, because eventually our unconscious is going to show it to us.
Eventually,
Whether
yeah.
it's a body ailment or not sleeping at all, or something, right? Something's going to happen that brings that up to the surface.
What's interesting is, like in our leaders, we kind of expect these qualities of toughness and strong and no mistake. Is that the kind of person you choose to be your friend? Who never admits a mistake? Who's got no vulnerabilities?
Yeah.
Who's got no capacity to look at themselves? Who's right about everything? Would you be friends with somebody like that?
Mm-mm.
But these are the people that we admire. There's such a split.
Yeah. I was talking to someone the other day, and it was interesting. I was not that excited actually to jump on the phone call. I was like, but it was kind of on my list of conversations. And as I was talking to him, he revealed something vulnerable. He was like, well, I miss connecting with you, and I feel like I'm worried that you don't like me or you don't want to connect with me or something like that.
Yeah.
I noticed instantly I softened.
No.
Like I was like not into the call, and instantly like he just revealed something that
Yeah.
allowed me to see him as a human being.
And how did that feel to you?
It felt so good.
Yeah.
I felt a lot of love. I was
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, okay. Like let's talk about the nervousness that we both feel in connecting.
Yeah.
And it was such a beautiful moment because I did not go into the call like that at all. But there was just one moment where he was just like, well, I just want you to know I feel a little inadequate sometimes reaching out to you or something like that. And I was so amazing, like instantly my heart was just like so there.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that's like so hard to remember, at least for me. Like it's hard to remember that's the chance to actually, that's the kind of door that allows me to kind of go through something.
Well, I think as human beings, we both want to be seen and accepted, and we want to see others. And so much of this culture is about putting up a front, putting up a mask. Like, look at something like Facebook. I mean, even the name, Facebook. Facebook, you know, and you create this face.
Yeah.
And what is it all about? You know, like Facebook is all about attachment, wanting love.
Yeah.
Because what do people have on Facebook? They have friends. And what do people do on Facebook? They like each other. This is all about, you know, human relationship. Except they don't have friends because they don't allow their real self to be seen.
Yeah.
So the friends are the friends of a face, not the real person.
Yeah.
And the people that like each other, they don't know each other to like each other.
Yeah.
They like an image.
Yeah.
And so the more friends you have, and the more they like you, the more addicted you get to it. Yeah. Why? There's a wonderful physician in San Diego, Dr. Vince Felitti. And Felitti is the one that initiated the very famous adverse childhood experiences studies, which showed the relationship between trauma or early childhood adversity and addiction and mental illness and autoimmune disease and so on. And Felitti said once that it's hard to get enough of something that almost works. If there's an emptiness inside me that I have to fill from the outside by people liking me, then every time I turn to the outside to fill that emptiness, that hole gets bigger.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the more people like you, the bigger that hole gets, and the more you need of it.
Yeah.
Because it almost works. It's like the heroin almost works to take the person's pain away, but only temporarily.
Yeah.
So being liked will give you satisfaction for a moment, but then you need even more and more and more.
Yeah.
And it's all because our attachment needs as children. We're so frustrated in this culture Again, we're not blaming individual parents. It's the how it isness of things. Our attachment needs were so frustrated that we keep trying to meet it through the external world.
Yeah.
And the social media feeds off that.
Yeah, it does. There was a CDC report on youth mental health recently, Center for Disease Control, and it said that it had a lot of really painful statistics, but one of them was that about 1 in 3 American teenage girls seriously considered committing suicide in 2021, I believe.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, what do you think's going on? Is it that we've lost touch with our own ability to have a sense of self that is independent of that world? And we also have young people now 6 to 7 hours a day on social media. But it's also hard just to blame any one entity. So I'm curious, what do you see happening in our world right now, particularly with young people?
I think the social media reinforces that despair, but I don't think it's the cause of it. So for the cause of it, and again, we have to throw out these genetic explanations of mental illness, because if it's genetic, why are they rising? Genes don't change in 10 years. What's going on? If more kids are, and there's this big mystery, both the New York Times and the New Yorker had articles in the last year about the mysterious rise in childhood suicides. There's nothing mysterious about it. It's about despair.
Yeah.
But where does the despair come from?
Yeah.
Well, human children are born with certain irreducible needs, and again, what's the word here? Conflict of interest. I'm pushing my book, The Myth of Normal, okay? Because it's got a chapter. It's got a chapter on children's irreducible needs. Think of it this way. Our lungs don't expect oxygen. Our lungs are an expectation for oxygen. If there wasn't oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere, we'd have no lungs. So it's not just that our lungs expect oxygen, they're an expectation for it. It's not a thought original to me, but I think it's a very, despite the fact that I didn't think of it, it's a really good thought, okay? It comes from the wonderful book, The Continuum Concept by Jean Lidloff. Wonderful book. So our lungs are an expectation for oxygen. The human child is also an expectation. Doesn't expect things, is an expectation of things. Wouldn't have evolved without those conditions being present, any more than lungs would have evolved. A human child is an expectation, certain needs that if they're met, that child will be fine. If they're not, there's going to be despair. Number one, a powerful, strong attachment relationship in which the child feels welcomed and accepted and seen and heard and enjoyed. Absolute need of the human infant. That's the first one. The second one is what a psychologist friend of mine calls rest. Rest means that the child shouldn't have to work to make their relationship work. They shouldn't have to be compliant, cute, smart, pretty, successful, anything. Nor should they have to try to reduce the parents' stresses by suppressing their own needs, which happens in a lot of families. So rest. The child shouldn't have to work to make the relationship work. That's the second irreducible need. The third one is the freedom and encouragement to experience and have validated all their emotions. Now, there's a great neuroscientist, unfortunately died a few years ago in his 70s, Dr. Jaak Panksepp, who distinguished some essential emotional brain circuits that we share with other mammals. We're wired for them. One of them is anger. We're wired for anger. Good thing, too. When somebody enters your space, oh, get out! That's healthy anger. Without that, where in nature would you live? When human beings evolved out in nature, as do other mammals, how long does any mammal survive without healthy anger, without a boundary? So that's one. Love or caring is another, because without that, the vulnerable don't get taken care of. And we're all vulnerable sometimes. Panic, fear, play. Play is essential. Play is much more important for brain development than academic learning, by the way. All animals play for a good reason. That's how they develop. Curiosity, seeking. Well, the child is a need. That's the third irreducible need, is to experience all these emotions when they're appropriate and have them validated. In our culture, so many of these are completely suppressed. The fourth need of the child is spontaneous free play out in nature. Okay? Now these are the irreducible needs of children. Now just go through all those four, you'll find two things about them. One is, when you study Aboriginal hunter-gatherer societies, they're exactly what's provided. And that's how we evolved for millions of years. And the second thing you'll find about them, try and find them with a magnifying glass in this culture. How many kids get those needs met? Because of the way we are taught to parent, the way that parents are stressed. When parents are stressed, they don't have the patience for their kids. When parents are told that when your kid is angry, give them a timeout. There's a very famous Canadian psychologist, who I hope you'll never have here, who says that, he'll remain unnamed, but who says in his mega-selling book, an angry child should be made to sit by themselves until they come back to normal. In other words, anger is not normal in a young child. Well, the message the child gets is, I can be loved or I can be angry, but I can't be both. I'm going to suppress my anger. And that's a template for depression. What do you call, by the way, what's the word depression means? It means to push something down. What gets pushed down in depression? Your emotions. Why do you push them down? Because your parents couldn't accept them. So I'm saying that this anxiety, this despair, is because of this society is more and more toxic and less capable of meeting our children's needs. Yeah. There's nothing surprising or mysterious about the rate of childhood suicides going up, depression going up, ADHD going up, anxiety going up, and so on and so forth. It's just what you'd expect given the conditions in this culture.
Yeah. And do you see any shifting of that? Do you see any hope that there's a potential shift in that kind of cultural structuring?
Well, in any society...
I mean, your book is... a lot of people are reading Myth of Normal. A lot of people are reading The Body Keeps the Score. A lot of people are starting to do this. But I was wondering, if you could kind of like have the levers, do you see any kind of opportunities where that could shift?
Well, Noam Chomsky was once asked if he's a pessimist or an optimist, and he said, strategically I'm an optimist and tactically I'm a pessimist. Which means that, and I'm with him kind of, in the long term, I'm very optimistic. Mm-hmm. In the short term, I think things are getting worse, more difficult for more people. Now, as we alluded to earlier, as a result of things getting more difficult, also more people are waking up. Yeah. So that I do see hope in that, and Bessel's book has been on the New York Times bestsellers list for 235 weeks now. It's a book about, a very heavy, dense book about trauma. Yeah. My book was 19 weeks on the New York Times list. It's been published in 34 countries. In English, it's the best-selling book in Sweden. Not the best-selling English book, the best-selling, in English, in Sweden. So now they're going to bring it out in Swedish. You know, so I think that, as we said earlier, as things get more difficult, more and more people are starting to wake up. Yeah. You know, and Almas, again, who's one of my great teachers, he said that the most difficult things in your life are also the kindest things. There's a part of you that will create difficulties to lead you back to yourself. And I've certainly seen, I don't recommend illness, physical or mental, as a way of waking up, but the fact is they can function that way.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing is true of a society.
Yeah.
So that some of the most difficult things that are going on right now in this culture are also the things that are waking up more and more people.
Yeah.
So I do have hope in that. I do have faith that people will wake up, and more and more people are, even as things get more difficult.
Yeah, beautiful. I have one more question, but I'm also wondering, is there anything we haven't touched upon that you're super excited to touch upon?
No, I can't think. I was going to make. I was going to ask you, why is it that you bring other people here before you brought?
That's okay. Let's get out that.
Let's talk about that,
Let's
shall
talk
we?
about. All right, let's talk about it. So,
No.
wow, okay.
No, but I
I'm
decided
really
not to ask that. Okay.
Well, we had
So-
never met before. Actually, we still haven't met.
Sorry?
We just only met like 5 minutes ago.
Oh, okay, very
Yeah.
good. Anyway, no, I think it's been a very complete and
Yeah. I have one more question for you, and we're going to take a few questions from the audience. Is
Sure.
that cool?
yeah, please.
So I think, one of the things that I know a lot of people is they're trying to find a vocation, and they're trying to find a way that what matters to them is aligned with their vocational life,
Yeah.
right? And I think some people look at you and we're like, fuck, he's been like speaking this with like courage and conviction for a lot of years,
Yeah.
even when the world was not so supportive of it. And then
Yeah.
I think you're 79, you're late 70s now or early 80s? Well, we don't need to talk about that. But a lot
No. I said, don't rush it. I'm 79.
79, okay, late 79.
I'll get there. I hope.
But for a lot of years, you had a determination.
Yeah.
Just to continue, whether it was a best-selling book or not a best-selling book,
Yeah.
or whether, right? And so it feels like you're this person that's this example to a lot of people, right? Of someone who really stuck by what's important to him and didn't let doubt and kept writing and kept talking. And they're looking to kind of feel that themselves, like that conviction, right? That bigger purpose. It's not about me, it's about this. And I'm wondering if you could say anything to harnessing that or tapping into that, or a life with heart, a path with heart, a path with purpose.
Yeah.
Is there any nuggets that might be supportive to somebody else who feels like their voice is not getting expressed in the way they want it to get expressed?
Well, I don't want to give a glib answer to that. I mean, I could just say, follow your dream and reach your destiny. But that's bullshit, because we live in a culture that doesn't particularly allow you to or encourage you to do it. I'm in a privileged position.
Yeah.
I'm a trained physician. I could always make a living no matter what people thought about my ideas. And then I had the sufficient talent to communicate well and write, and so I could say what I wanted to, and be not only respected for it, but also remunerated for it. Now, these are class distinctions.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people in this society who have to get up early in the morning. I mean, 25% of women in your country have to go back to work within 2 weeks of giving birth, which means a massive abandonment of children, socially engendered. It's based on race and class. So who am I to say to somebody,
Yeah.
a single mom, perhaps a racialized mom, dream your dream and live your destiny?
Yeah.
So I don't want to get too carried away with that stuff, because it is very much a matter of class, privilege, race, and so on. So within that context, there's two things you need to figure out. Now, having said that, I wish I could show you a 4-minute video that's on my laptop. It's a video sent to me by a person on death row in Texas. They've been there for over 20 years now. Seeing their friends carried away to their deaths.
Wow.
and they're full of life, they're full of gratitude, they're full of mindfulness, they're full of love, full of gratitude. I think, my God, when I think how resentful I get when I stub my little toe. In other words, on the one hand, it is and this person is living their destiny. Not their destiny, I should say. They're living their dream, they're living who they are. And they work online helping young kids not follow their particular path.
Wow.
So if it's possible to find your purpose on a death row in Texas, surely it's possible for a lot of other people.
Yeah. And we can play, if you want to give me the video, we'll play it tomorrow morning.
Oh yeah, it's on my laptop. I can bring it
great.
tomorrow. It's quite astonishing. It's quite astonishing. But to answer your question then, in the context that I've laid out, again in the Myth of Normal, we have this chapter called Before the Body Says No. And the first fundamental question is, where you're not saying no, where there's a no that wants to be said, whether it's in personal relationships or on a job. Because as long as you're not saying no, you will not find your calling. You'll not have time to develop your interest. And then it's a set of 6 questions as this exercise, and the last one is, where you're not saying yes. Where's the yes that wants to be said? Now, when I was a workaholic doctor, every once in a while I'd sit there in silence, very rarely, and I talk about this in a couple of my books, and I have this little tingling at the pit of my belly, and I wouldn't know if it was heartburn or inspiration, but if I listened, there's a voice that said, writing. It kept getting louder. And then I realized I needed to write.
Wow.
That's the yes that I wasn't saying.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't saying no to all the demands of work.
Yeah.
So ask yourself, where am I not saying no, and where am I not saying yes? Those 2 questions will help to guide you to your
Beautiful.
to your calling.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
So if we can get the lights up a little bit in the room, and there's a few mics. We're not going to get to everybody's questions, but if you have a question and you want to walk up, please do so. It's best if you go to the mic, otherwise we're going to have to repeat it. And if you can do the tweet version of your question, that would be wonderful. And if you can maybe just say your name.
By the way, can I just ask, I came here with early, my wife Ray was still back at the hotel. Ray, are you here? Yes. Are you here? Yes.
Right.
Would you stand up for a minute and say hello to everybody?
Anything you want to correct or change or like modify? No? Yeah, is he doing? Okay. So, yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Tatiana. I was going to start this with something about identity. Now I'm all self-conscious about it, but I'm going to do it anyway. I grew up in a Jewish family. I'm from Eastern Ukraine. And one of the things, as you probably know, there's not just the family trauma, right? But there is a lot of cultural trauma. And the trauma that is happening now, I had family members with young children hiding in a bomb shelter in Eastern Ukraine.
This is in Ukraine?
Yeah,
okay.
Last year.
Yeah.
And the question is, and you can answer either one of these, when you look at a situation like that and know that there are children hiding in a bomb shelter right now and young children being raped and that they're witnessing this, where is the hope that you find? How do you think about it? And then what can we do as a society watching that in a way to bring at least the energy of compassion to that situation?
Yeah. So a couple of things come up for me, and I don't think I can give you an adequate answer. Let me just start with that. But number one, I can tell you something interesting that was found in Britain in the Second World War. As you know, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was bombing Britain. Heavy bombing, many casualties. Some children were evacuated to the countryside to be away from the threat of the bombing. Others stayed in London and Coventry, where the bombing was taking place, with their parents in the bomb shelters and the underground and so on. It was found both in Britain and in a similar study in Finland that the children that had stayed with their parents were emotionally, mentally more healthy out later on than the kids who had been separated. So what protected the kids was the attachment relationship with the parents. So even, there was that very beautiful Italian film many years ago now called It's a Beautiful Life. Mm-hmm. Some people criticized the film for trivializing the genocide. It didn't do that. But the essence of the film was that the love of this father and the attachment relationship of the father to the child and the child to the father essentially kept the child okay. So I think attachment relationships need to be really fostered and paid attention to. Number one. Easy to say, not so easy to do, but that's the reality. The second thing I'll tell you is that I was speaking to somebody in the Ukraine, one of my students in Compassion Inquiry, and she said that what she was experiencing and witnessing is that because of the threat and because of this invasion, people were actually cohering more together. They're finding meaning that they hadn't found before, in a certain sense. I don't want to romanticize it, but I'm just reporting what she's telling me. I remember my father. My father was in forced labor as a Jewish male. He had to be in forced labor for the Hungarian army in the Second World War, under very dire conditions. But interestingly enough, he always talked about those days as some of the most meaningful ones of his life. Why? Because of the camaraderie and the togetherness with his cohort. Mm. So that communal cohesion and attachment, those are the only answers I can think of. Okay? Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Maté. I want to thank you so much for your work. It means a lot to me. My name's Tess, and my question is, what can we do on a wide scale to structure healing within society?
To structure healing within a society? Well, there's sort of the answer that's limited to the health field. Then there's a broader answer. Let me give you the broader one first. In Canada, now, indigenous people never used to have autoimmune disease prior to colonialism. Today, an indigenous woman in Canada has a risk of rheumatoid arthritis 6 times that of anybody else. And people of color in this country, Hispanic people, people of color, indigenous people, have much higher rates of autoimmune disease than Caucasians. Women have 80% of autoimmune disease. These are not individual genetic health factors. These are social phenomena. You can't address health in isolation from what's happening in the culture. And it's always the most vulnerable, the least empowered, who are higher risk for disease. And you saw this during COVID. So this is a social question. Children whose parents are stressed are much more likely to have asthma. A black woman in this country, the more episodes of racism she has to endure, the higher her risk for asthma. So is asthma simply an inflammation of the airways and a narrowing of the airways in an individual organ in an isolated body, or is it a social malaise? Well, you can't deal with it simply as an isolated physiological event, because the physiology is inseparable from the psychology, and the psychology is inseparable from social conditions and relationships. So there's no broad answer to the health issue in this country or in any country without looking at all the social factors that bear upon individual health. In the health field, if they only, like the mind-body unity that I demonstrate or bring all the literature forward in my books, I didn't invent it. 2,500 years ago in Greece, Socrates said that the problem with the doctors of today is that they separate the mind from the body. The doctors of today, 2,500 years ago. In 1870, Jean-Marie Charcot, who first described multiple sclerosis, said this was a stress-driven disease. In 1890, Sir William Osler, a great Canadian-American and British physician, said that rheumatoid arthritis was a stress-driven disease. In 1870, Paget, a British surgeon, breast surgeon, said that breast cancer in women is largely driven by emotional factors. And since then, we've had the science to prove it. But let me ask you all a question here. This is the question I didn't ask because I couldn't see you all, but now I can. Raise your hand if in the last 5 years you've been to a gastroenterologist, rheumatologist, neurologist, respirologist, cardiologist, neurologist, any kind of an ologist. Just raise your hand, okay? Okay, great, terrific, a lot of people. Now raise your hand again if they ask you about childhood trauma. Do I see any hands at all? Maybe not. Did they ask you about stress in your life? Few hands. Did they ask you about your relationship to your spouse? How you feel about your work? Did they ask you about how you feel about yourself as a human being? These questions had everything to do while you were there in the office. So in the health field, it'd be a tremendous step forward if they only taught science to medical students. The science, totally non-controversial, of mind-body unity, the science of trauma. So there's that broad social answer, and then there's the specific answer in the health field. How to make that, how to bring that about, I haven't got a clue. Because the system is designed not to change. But we all can work at it. Okay? Wish I could tell you more.
Thank you so much for...
And we'll probably have time just for a few more, but
Yeah,
please
sure.
go ahead.
Thank you so much for your important work and your talk, Dr. Maté. My name is Hoon-Jung Kim. My question is if you could share more about healthy anger and potentially share some specific examples
Sure.
on how we can express anger in a more healthy way.
Got it. What's your name?
Hoon-Jung Kim.
How do
You
you
can call
say?
me HJ, that's easier.
HK?
HJ works.
Okay, thank you. All right. Do you mind participating in an experiment with me right now?
Sure.
About
He's
healthy
gonna get you
anger?
angry.
All right.
Okay,
All right.
okay.
Okay.
I'll try.
Okay, great. How do you feel about the distance between you and I right now? If I gave the rest of my talk from up here, is that okay with you?
It's okay. It's not ideal, but it's this...
No, but is it okay with you? That you stood there and I stood here, is that okay?
I'm fine with it.
Okay, you're fine with it. Great, yeah. Now, how would you feel about it now if I stood 1 inch from your face and did the rest of my talk from there? How would you feel about that? Would that become...
That would be too close.
That'd be yeah, okay. What would you... No. In this experiment, where you're standing is your life, so you can't leave it, okay? This is your life. You can do whatever you need to do, but you can't leave it, okay? So I'm standing 1 inch from your face. You don't like it. What would you like to do about it?
If I can't leave where I am, I guess I would.
You can't leave.
Then I would try and have you move away from me.
How would you try to do that?
I would first ask you to move.
Okay, and I say, very nice, I don't care what you ask, okay? Now what?
I would not want to push you.
You'll push him. Okay. Okay, very good. As you're pushing me, what emotion do you think you'd be generating?
Fear and anger. Both.
Anger. That's healthy anger. Okay? Healthy anger is simply a boundary defense. It says, you're in my space, get out. That way we don't have to fight. Because if I heed your anger, I'm going to step away. Okay? So healthy anger is just about, that's why our brain is wired for anger. Okay? Now, that's healthy anger. In general, the role of the emotions is to allow in, like somebody else in your life, maybe a partner or a spouse or a child, you might want to come even closer. You might want to hug them close, right? So the role of emotions in general is to invite in what is healthy and welcome and nurturing, and to keep out what is unwanted and hostile, right? You got that? Trick question. What's the role of the immune system? It's exactly the same thing. To allow in what is healthy, healthy bacteria, nutriments, vitamins, so on. Keep out what is unhealthy. The news is they're all one system. When you're suppressing the one, you're suppressing the other. That's why people get autoimmune disease and a lot of malignancies. Now, that's healthy anger is a boundary defense. It's like an emotional immune system. Keep out. Unhealthy anger, then there's the repression of anger, where it's so deep you can't even generate it. That's what leads to all kinds of stress and illness. But then there's unhealthy anger, which is not based on boundary defense in the present moment, but some hurt being triggered from the past. And then healthy anger, once you express it and it's done its job of protecting your boundaries, is over when it's done its job. It's gone. You don't have to keep raging about something. It's done its job. Unhealthy rage, which, by the way, is also a risk factor for heart disease and strokes and high blood pressure, unhealthy rage keeps on growing and growing and growing and growing, regardless of the stimulus. So that's the distinction between healthy anger and unhealthy anger. Fair enough?
Yeah, that's very clarifying. Is a way to think of it, sort of a real-time boundary defense, is kind of expressing your anger and letting that out in a healthy way.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We just have time for one more, so sorry we can't get to everybody, but we have time for one more.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maté. My name is Heather, and I'm from Minnesota. I'm really interested in applying your ideas at a systems level.
On what?
Healthcare in this country is in crisis, and there are many reasons for that, but in my viewpoint, something that's not talked about so often is because the healthcare system itself is trauma organized, and also because many of the human aspects of healing, the relational aspects of healing, have sort of been pushed into the corners of the room. And so I'm curious, if you were to take a systems lens, how would you approach healing a trauma-organized healthcare system?
So let me tell you a few things. Somebody once said, how do you organize a cult? How do you create a cult? Well, you give them a special jargon and a uniform. You sleep deprive them. You separate them from their families, and you put them under authority and leaders. In other words, you send them to medical school. Okay? So medical school is very traumatizing for a lot of people. That's the first fact that I'll tell you. The second fact I'll tell you, there is something called, actually, Elisa Apple, who's a dear friend, and I don't know if she's here tonight, but she's speaking at the conference in the next day or two. And Elisa has done a lot of work on telomeres, And telomeres are, she'll talk about it much more articulately, but they're structures at the end of chromosomes that keep the chromosomes together. And the longer that they are, the healthier the chromosome. And as we get older, they fray, the chromosomes, the telomeres fray, and so do we, but stress also shortens the telomeres. They looked at the telomeres of medical residents and other people the same age, and in 1 year, the medical residents, they lost a lot more length in their telomere than other people their age. So we're talking about a highly stressed profession. Number 3, some studies have indicated that the highest level of empathy and compassion that medical students have is right before their training. So you've got kind of a system, you could say it's designed that way, but it's not that it's consciously designed that way. Systems kind of design themselves. They kind of start this system generates itself to generate profit and to generate power. That's the essence of it. If you want a system that generates power and profit, you're not going to train medical students in trauma, because if you come to me with depression, and I say, hey, you got a problem with lack of serotonin in your brain, and I'm going to give you Prozac, which will elevate your serotonin level. That takes me 2 minutes. 20 milligrams a day, come back in a month. But if I had to talk to you about why you depressed your emotions in the first place, in your family of origin, I'm going to have to spend time with you. Not very profitable. Even if I had the insight. So what you're asking me is, how do you create sanity inside a system that is designed for power and profit? Well, this is a political question. It's not a medical question. It's not a health question. And some people are making beautiful initiatives here and there, create community-based healthcare, patient-empowered healthcare, multidisciplinary healthcare. But as a system as a whole, the people that have and wield power and who garner the profits, and they're the ones who have the ears of not the ears, the pocketbooks of politicians. The same thing. A politician hears through their pocketbooks, and they're in charge. That's what has to be challenged. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you. So we're just about out of time. Gabor, I want to thank you for finally saying yes to my invitation.
Thank you.
Finally. And Ray and Gabor, just a deep bow to your work in the world and what it means to be honest and vulnerable, and kind of examples of a couple and a voice in the world that I think people are really needing to hear. I know it's not your voice, but we need people that it's coming through to help move things in the right way. And I think in some ways things have never been worse if you look at the statistics on youth mental health and depression. And in some ways, things are incredibly, have never been better in terms of the interest and the openness, and the fact that you can talk now about a trauma relationship or trauma-based reactions, where 5 years I would never hear that.
That's right.
And so just a deep bow and a deep thank you for all your work in the world.
And thank you for finally inviting me.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Gabor Maté, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much.